Introduction, Part 1 of Volume 1 of A Voyage towards the South Pole. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by David Cole, Medway, Massachusetts. A Voyage towards the South Pole and Round the World, Volume 1 by James Cook. Introduction, Part 1. Formal title: A Voyage towards the South Pole and Round the World, performed in His Majesty's ships, the Resolution and Adventure, in the years 1772, 3, 4, and 5. Written by James Cook, Commander of the Resolution, in which is included Captain Furneaux's narrative of his proceedings in the adventure during the separation of the ships, in 2 volumes illustrated with maps and charts, and a variety of portraits of persons and views and places, drawn during the voyage by Mr. Hodges, and engraved by the most eminent masters. General Introduction. Whether the unexplored part of the southern hemisphere be only an immense mass of water, or contain another continent, as speculative geography seemed to suggest, was a question which had long engaged the attention, not only of learned men, but of most of the maritime powers of Europe. To put an end to all diversity of opinion about a matter so curious and important, was His Majesty's principal motive in directing this voyage to be undertaken, the history of which is now submitted to the public. But, in order to give the reader a clear idea of what has been done in it, and to enable him to judge more accurately how far the great object that was proposed has been obtained, it will be necessary to prefix a short account of the several voyages which have been made on discoveries to the southern hemisphere, prior to that which I had lately the honour to conduct, and which I am now going to relate. 1519. Magellan's. The first who crossed the vast Pacific Ocean was Ferdinand Magellan's, a Portuguese who, in the service of Spain, sailed from Seville with 5 ships on the 10th of April 1519. He discovered the straits which bear his name, and having passed through them on the 27th of November 1520, entered the South Pacific Ocean. In this sea he discovered 2 uninhabited islands, whose situations are not well known. He afterwards crossed the line, discovered the Ladrone Islands, and then proceeded to the Philippines, in one of which he was killed in a skirmish with the natives. His ship, called the Victory, was the first that circumnavigated the globe, and the only one of his squadron that surmounted the dangers and distresses which attended this heroic enterprise. The Spaniards, after Magellan's had showed them the way, made several voyages from America to the westward, previous to that of Alvaro Mendana de Neira in 1595, which is the first that can be traced step by step, for the antecedent expeditions are not handed down to us with much precision. We know, however, in general that, in them, New Guinea, the islands called Solomons, and several others were discovered. Geographers differ greatly concerning the situation of the Solomon Islands. The most probable opinion is, that they are the cluster which comprises what has since been called New Britain, New Ireland, etc. 1595 Mendana. On the 9th of April 1595, Mendana, with intention to settle these islands, sailed from Callao with 4 ships, and his discoveries in his route to the west were the Marquesas, in the latitude of 10 degrees south, the island of San Bernardo, which I take to be the same that Commodore Byron calls the Isle of Danger; after that, Solitary Island, in the latitude of 10 degrees 40 minutes south, longitude 178 degrees west; and lastly, Santa Cruz, which is undoubtedly the same that Captain Carteret calls Egmont Island. In this last island Mendana, with many of his companions, died, and the shattered remains of the squadron were conducted to Manila by Pedro Fernandez de Queiroz, the chief pilot. 1605. Queiroz. This same Queiroz was the first sent out, with the sole view of discovering a sunken continent, and, indeed, he seems to have been the first who had any idea of the existence of one. He sailed from Callao the 21st of December, 1605, as pilot of the fleet, commanded by Luis Paz de Torres, consisting of 2 ships and a tender, and steering to the west-southwest on the 26th of January, 1606, being then, by their reckoning, 1,000 Spanish leagues from the coast of America. They discovered a small low island in latitude 26 degrees south. 2 days after, they discovered another that was high, with a plain on the top. This is probably the same that Captain Carteret calls Pitcairn's Island. After leaving these islands, Queiroz seems to have directed his course to west-northwest and northwest, to 10 or 11 degrees south latitude, and then westward, till he arrived at the Bay of St. Philip and Iago, in the island of Tierra del Espiritu Santo. In this route he discovered several islands, probably some of these that have been seen by later navigators. On leaving the Bay of St. Philip and St. Iago, the 2 ships were separated. Queiroz, with a Capitana, stood to the north, and returned to New Spain, after having suffered greatly for want of provisions and water. Torres, with the Almiranta and the tender, steered to the west, and seems to have been the first who sailed between New Holland and New Guinea. 1615. Le Maire and Schouten. The next attempt to make discoveries in the South Pacific Ocean was conducted by Le Maire and Schouten. They sailed from the Texel on the 14th of June 1615, with the ships Concord and Horn. The latter was burnt by accident in Port Desire. With the other, they discovered the straits that bear the name of Le Maire, and were the first who ever entered the Pacific Ocean by the way of Cape Horn. They discovered the island of Dogs in latitude 15 degrees 15 minutes south, longitude 136 degrees 30 minutes west, Cendre Grant in 15 degrees south latitude, and 143 degrees 10 minutes west longitude, Vaterland in 14 degrees 46 minutes south, and 144 degrees 10 minutes west, and 25 leagues westward of this, Fly Island in latitude 15 degrees 20 minutes, Traitors and Cocos Islands in latitude 15 degrees 43 minutes south, longitude 173 degrees 13 minutes west. 2 degrees more to the westward, the Isle of Hope, and in the latitude of 14 degrees 56 minutes south, longitude 179 degrees 30 minutes east, Horn Island. They next coasted the north side of New Britain and New Guinea, and arrived at Batavia in October 1616. 1642. Tasman. Except some discoveries on the western and northern coasts of New Holland, no important voyage to the Pacific Ocean was undertaken till 1642, when Captain Tasman sailed from Batavia with 2 ships belonging to the Dutch East India Company, and discovered Van Diemen's Land, a small part of the western coast of New Zealand, the Friendly Isles, and those called Prince William's. 1594. Sir Richard Hawkins. Thus far I have thought it best not to interrupt the progress of discovery in the South Pacific Ocean, otherwise I should before have mentioned that Sir Richard Hawkins in 1594, being about 50 leagues to the eastward of the River Plate, was driven by a storm to the eastward of his intended course, and, when the weather grew moderate, steering towards the Straits of Magellan's, he unexpectedly fell in with land, about 60 leagues of which he coasted, and has very particularly described. This he named Hawkins Maiden Land, in honour of his royal mistress, Queen Elizabeth, and says it lies some 80 leagues from the nearest part of South America, 1689 strong. This land was afterwards discovered to be 2 large islands by Captain John Strong of the Farewell, from London, who, in 1689, passed through the straits that divides the eastern from the western of those islands. To this strait he gave the name of Falkland Sound in honour of his patron Lord Falkland, and the name has since been extended, through inadvertency, to the 2 islands it separates. Having mentioned these islands, I will add, that future navigators will misspend their time if they look for Pepys Island in 47° south, it being now certain that Pepys Island is none other than these islands of Falkland. 1675 La Roche. In April 1675 Anthony La Roche, an English merchant, in his return from the South Pacific Ocean, where he had been on a trading voyage, being carried by the winds and currents far to the east of Strait Le Maire, fell in with a coast, which may possibly be the same with that which I visited during this voyage, and have called the island of Georgia. Leaving this land and sailing to the north, La Roche, in the latitude of 45° south, discovered a large island, with a good port towards the eastern part, where he found wood, water, and fish. 1699 Halley. In 1699 that celebrated astronomer, Dr. Edmund Halley, was appointed to the command of His Majesty's ship, the Paramour Pink, on an expedition for improving the knowledge of the longitude and of the variation of the compass, and for discovering the unknown lands supposed to lie on the southern part of the Atlantic Ocean. In this voyage he determined the longitude of several places, and after his return constructed his variation chart, and proposed a method of observing the longitude at sea by means of the appulses and occultations of the fixed stars. But, though he so successfully attended to the 2 first articles of instructions, he did not find any unknown southern land. 1721 Roggeveen. The Dutch in 1721 fitted out 3 ships to make discoveries in the South Pacific Ocean, under the command of Admiral Roggeveen. He left the Texel on the 21st of August, and arriving in that ocean, by going round Cape Horn, discovered Easter Island, probably seen before, though not visited by Davis. Footnote: see Vase's description of the Isthmus of Darien. End footnote. Then, between 14° 41' and 15° 47' south latitude, and between the longitude of 142° and 150° west, fell in with several other islands, which I take to be some of those seen by the later English navigators. He next discovered 2 islands in latitude 15° south, longitude 170° west, which he calls Bowman's Islands, and lastly, Single Island, in latitude 13° 41' south, longitude 171° 30' west. These 3 islands are undoubtedly the same that Bougainville calls the Isles of Navigators. 1738 Bouvet. In 1738 the French East India Company sent Lozier Bouvet with 2 ships, the Eagle and Mary, to make discoveries in the South Atlantic Ocean. He sailed from Port L'Orient on the 19th of July in that year, touched at the island of St. Catherine, and from thence shaped his course towards the southeast. On the 1st of January 1739 he discovered land, or what he judged to be land, in latitude 54° south, longitude 11° east. It will appear in the course of the following narrative that we made several attempts to find this land without success. It is therefore very probable that what Bouvet saw was nothing more than a large ice island. From hence he stood to the east, in 51° of latitude to 35° of east longitude, after which the two ships separated, one going to the island of Mauritius, and the other returning to France. After this voyage of Bouvet, the spirit of discovery ceased, till his present Majesty formed a design of making discoveries, and exploring the southern hemisphere, and in the year 1764 directed it to be put in execution. 1764 Byron. Accordingly, Commodore Byron, having under his command the Dolphin and Tarner, sailed from the Downs on the 21st of June the same year, and having visited the Falkland Islands, passed through the Straits of Magellan's into the Pacific Ocean, where he discovered the Islands of Disappointment, George's, Prince of Wales, the Isles of Danger, York Island, and Byron Island. 1766 Wallis. He returned to England the 9th of May 1766, and, in the month of August following, the Dolphin was again sent out under the command of Captain Wallis, with the Swallow, commanded by Captain Carteret. They proceeded together till they came to the west end of the Straits of Magellan's, and the Great South Sea in sight, where they were separated. Captain Wallis directed his course more westerly than any navigator had done before him in so high a latitude, but met with no land till he got within the tropic, where he discovered the islands of Whitsunday, Queen Charlotte, Egmont, Duke of Gloucester, Duke of Cumberland, Maitea, Otaheite, Eimeo, Tapamanu, Howe, Scilly, Boscawen, Keppel, and Wallis, and returned to England in May 1768. Carteret. His companion Captain Carteret kept a different route, in which he discovered the islands of Osnaburg, Gloucester, Queen Charlotte's Isles, Carteret's, Gower's, and the strait between New Britain and New Ireland, and returned to England in March 1769. 1766 Bougainville. In November 1766 Commodore Bougainville sailed from France in the frigate La Boudeuse, with the store ship L'Etoile. After spending some time on the coast of Brazil and at Falkland Islands, he got into the Pacific Sea by the Straits of Magellan's in January 1768. In this ocean he discovered the four Farkadines, the Isle of Lanciers, and Harp Island, which I take to be the same that I afterwards called Lagoon, Thrum Cap, and Bow Island. About 20 leagues farther to the west he discovered 4 other islands, afterwards fell in with Maitea, Otaheite, Isles of Navigators, and Forlorn Hope, which to him were new discoveries. He then passed through between the Hebrides, discovered the shoal of Diana, and some others, the land of Cape Deliverance, several islands more to the north, passed the north of New Ireland, touched at Batavia, and arrived in France in March 1769. This year was rendered remarkable by a transit of the planet Venus over the sun's disk, a phenomenon of great importance to astronomy, and which everywhere engaged the attention of the learned in that science. In the beginning of the year 1768, the Royal Society presented a memorial to His Majesty, setting forth the advantages to be derived from accurate observations of this transit in different parts of the world, particularly from a set of such observations made in a southern latitude, between the 140th and 130th degrees of longitude, west from the Royal Observatory at Greenwich, and that vessels properly equipped would be necessary to convey the observers to their destined stations, but that the Society were in no condition to defray the expense of such an undertaking. In consequence of this memorial, the Admiralty were directed by His Majesty to provide proper vessels for this purpose. Accordingly, the Endeavour bark, which had been built for the coal trade, was purchased and fitted out for the southern voyage, and I was honoured with the command of her. The Royal Society soon after appointed me, in conjunction with Mr. Charles Green the astronomer, to make the requisite observations on the transit. It was at first intended to form this great, and now a principal business of our voyage, either at the Marquesas, or else at one of those islands which Tasman had called Amsterdam, Rotterdam, and Middleburg, now better known under the name of the Friendly Islands. But while the Endeavour was getting ready for the expedition, Captain Wallis returned from his voyage round the world, in the course of which he had discovered several islands in the Southern Sea, and among others Otaheite. This island was preferred to any of those before mentioned, on account of the conveniences it afforded, because its place had been well ascertained, and found to be extremely well suited to our purpose. I was therefore ordered to proceed directly to Otaheite, and after astronomical observations should be completed, to prosecute the design of making discoveries in the South Pacific Ocean, by proceeding to the south as far as the latitude of 40 degrees. Then, if I found no land, to proceed to the west between 40 degrees and 35 degrees, till I fell in with New Zealand, which I was to explore, and thence to return to England, by such route as I should think proper. 1768. Cook's first voyage. In the prosecution of these instructions, I sailed from Deptford the 30th July, 1768, from Plymouth the 26th of August, touched at Madeira, Rio de Janeiro, and Straits Le Maire, and entered the South Pacific Ocean by Cape Horn in January the following year. I endeavoured to make a direct course to Otaheite, and in part succeeded, but I made no discovery till I got within the tropic, where I fell in with Lagoon Island, two groups, Bird Island, Chain Island, and on the 13th of April arrived at Otaheite, where I remained 3 months, during which time the observations on the transit were made. I then left it, discovered and visited the Society Islands and Oheteroa, thence proceeded to the south, till I arrived in the latitude of 40 degrees 22 minutes, longitude 147 degrees 29 minutes west, and on the 6th of October fell in with the east side of New Zealand. I continued exploring the coast of this country till the 31st of March 1770, when I quitted it, and proceeded to New Holland, and having surveyed the eastern part of that vast country, which part had not before been visited, I passed between its northern extremity and New Guinea, landed on the latter, touched at the island of Savu, Batavia, the Cape of Good Hope, and St. Helena. In the account given of St. Helena in the narrative of my former voyage, I find 2 mistakes. Its inhabitants are far from exercising a wanton cruelty over their slaves, and they have had wheel carriages and porters' knots for many years. And arrived in England on the 12th of July, 1771. In this voyage I was accompanied by Mr. Banks and Dr. Solander, the first a gentleman of ample fortune, the other an accomplished disciple of Linnaeus, and one of the librarians of the British Museum. Both of them distinguished in the learned world, for their extensive and accurate knowledge of natural history. These gentlemen, animated by the love of science, and by a desire to pursue their inquiries in the remote regions I was preparing to visit, desired permission to make a voyage with me. The Admiralty readily complied with a request that promised such advantage to the Republic of Letters. They accordingly embarked with me, and participated in all the dangers and sufferings of our tedious and fatiguing navigation. The voyages of Messrs. de Surville, Kerguelen, and Marion, of which some account is given in the following work, did not come to my knowledge time enough to afford me any advantage; and as they have not been communicated to the world in a public way, I can say little about them, or about 2 other voyages, which, I am told, have been made by the Spaniards, one to Easter Island in the year 1769, and the other to Otaheite in 1775. End of Introduction, Part 1. Part 2 of A Voyage Towards the South Pole and Round the World, Volume 1, by James Cook. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by David Cole. Introduction, Part 2. Before I begin my narrative of the expedition entrusted to my care, it will be necessary to add here some account of its equipment, and of some other matters equally interesting connected with my subject. Soon after my return home in the Endeavour, it was resolved to equip 2 ships to complete the discovery of the southern hemisphere. The nature of this voyage required ships of a particular construction, and the Endeavour being gone to Falkland Isles as a storeship, the Navy Board was directed to purchase 2 such ships as were most suitable for this service. At this time various opinions were espoused by different people touching the size and kind of vessels most proper for such a voyage. Some were for having large ships, and proposed those of 40 guns, or East India Company's ships. Others preferred large good sailing frigates, or 3-decked ships, employed in the Jamaica trade, fitted with roundhouses. But of all that was said and offered to the Admiralty's consideration on this subject, as far as come to my knowledge, what, in my opinion, was most to the purpose, was suggested by the Navy Board. As the kind of ships most proper to be employed on discoveries is a very interesting consideration to the adventurers in such undertakings, it may possibly be of use to those who, in future, may be so employed, to give here the purport of the sentiments of the Navy Board thereon, with whom, after the experience of 2 voyages of 3 years each, I perfectly agree. The success of such undertakings as making discoveries in distant parts of the world will principally depend on the preparations being well adapted to what ought to be the first considerations, namely, the preservation of the adventurers and ships, and this will ever chiefly depend on the kind, the size, and the properties of the ships chosen for the service. These primary considerations will not admit of any other that may interfere with the necessary properties of the ships. Therefore, in choosing the ships, should any of the most advantageous properties be wanting, and the necessary room in them be in any degree diminished for less important purposes, such a step would be laying a foundation for rendering the undertaking abortive in the first instance. As the greatest danger to be apprehended and provided against on a voyage of discovery, especially to the most distant parts of the globe, is that of the ships being liable to be run aground on an unknown, desert, or perhaps savage coast, so no consideration should be set in competition with that of her being of a construction of the safest kind, in which the officers may, with the least hazard, venture upon a strange coast. A ship of this kind must not be of a great draught of water, yet of a sufficient burden and capacity to carry a proper quantity of provisions and necessaries for her complement of men, and for the time requisite to perform the voyage. She must also be of a construction that will bear to take the ground, and of a size which, in case of necessity, may be safely and conveniently laid on shore to repair any accidental damage or defect. These properties are not to be found in ships of war of 40 guns, nor in frigates, nor in East India Company's ships, nor in large 3-decked West India ships, nor indeed in any other but North Country built ships, or such as are built for the coal trade, which are peculiarly adapted to this purpose. In such a vessel an able sea officer will be most venturesome, and better enabled to fulfil his instructions than he possibly can, or indeed than would be prudent for him to attempt, in one of any other sort or size. Upon the whole, I am firmly of opinion that no ships are so proper for discoveries in distant unknown parts as those constructed as was the Endeavour, in which I performed my former voyage. for no ships of any other kind can contain stores and provisions sufficient, in proportion to the necessary number of men, considering the length of time it will be necessary they should last. And even if another kind of ships would stow a sufficiency, yet on arriving at the parts for discovery, they would still, from the nature of their construction and size, be less fit for the purpose. Hence it may be concluded, so little progress had been hitherto made in discoveries in the southern hemisphere, for all ships which attempted it before the Endeavour were unfit for it, although the officers employed in them had done the utmost in their power. It was upon this consideration that the Endeavour was chosen for that voyage. It was to those properties in her that those on board owed their preservation, and hence we were enabled to prosecute discoveries in those seas so much longer than any other ship ever did or could do. And although discovery was not the first object of that voyage, I could venture to traverse a far greater space of sea, till then unnavigated, to discover greater tracts of country in high and low southern latitude, and to persevere longer in exploring and surveying more correctly the extensive coasts of those newly discovered countries, than any former navigator perhaps had done during one voyage. In short, those properties in the ships, with perseverance and resolution in their commanders, will enable them to execute their orders, to go beyond former discoverers, and to continue to Britain the reputation of taking the lead of nations in exploring the globe. These considerations concurring with Lord Sandwich's opinion on the same subject, the Admiralty determined to have 2 such ships as are here recommended. Accordingly 2 were purchased of Captain William Hammond of Hull. They were both built at Whitby, by the same person who built the Endeavour, being about 14 or 16 months old at the time they were purchased, and were, in my opinion, as well adapted to the intended service as if they had been built for the purpose. The largest of the 2 was 462 tons burden. She was named Resolution, and sent to Deptford to be equipped. The other was 336 tons burden. She was named Adventure, and sent to be equipped at Woolwich. It was at first proposed to sheathe them with copper, but on considering that copper corrodes the ironwork, especially about the rudder, this intention was laid aside, and the old method of sheathing and fitting pursued, as being the most secure. For although it was usual to make the rubber bands of the same composition, it was not, however, so durable as iron, nor would it, I am well assured, last out such a voyage as the Resolution performed. Therefore, till a remedy is found to prevent the effect of copper upon ironwork, it would not be advisable to use it on a voyage of this kind, as the principal fastenings of the ship being iron, they may be destroyed. On the 28th of November 1771 I was appointed to the command of the Resolution, and Tobias Furneaux, who had been second lieutenant with Captain Wallis, was promoted on this occasion to the command of the Adventures. Our complements of officers and men were fixed, as in the following table. Resolution. Officers and men. Officers' names. Captain 1. James Cook. Lieutenants 3. Robert P. Cooper, Charles Clerker, Richard Pickersgill. Master 1. Joseph Gilbert. Boatswain 1. James Gray. Carpenter 1. James Wallis. Gunner 1. Robert Anderson. Surgeon 1. James Patton. Master's mates 3. Midshipmen 6. Surgeon's mates 2. Captain's clerk 1. Master at arms 1. Corporal 1. Armourer 1. Armourer's mate 1. Sailmaker 1. Boatswain's mate 3. Carpenter's mate 3. Gunner's mate 2. Carpenter's crews 4. Cook 1. Cook's mate 1. Quartermaster 6. able seamen 45. Marines: Lieutenant 1, John Edgecombe, Sergeant 1, Corporals 2, Drummer 1, Privates 15. Total 112. Adventure: Officers and men. Officers' names: Captain 1, Tobias Furneaux. Lieutenants 3, Joseph Shank, Arthur Kemper. Master 1, Peter Fannin. Boatswain 1, Edward Johns. Carpenter 1, William Offord. Gunner 1, Andrew Gloag. Surgeon 1, Thomas Andrews. Master's Mate 2. Midshipmen 4, Surgeon's Mates 2, Captain's Clerk 1, Master at Arms 1, Master at Arms Mate 1, Sailmaker 1, Sailmaker's Mate 1, Boatswain's Mate 1, Carpenter's Mate 2, Gunner's Mate 2, Carpenter's Crews 1, Cook 4, Cook's Mate 1, Quartermasters 4, able seamen 33. Marines: Lieutenant 1, James Scott. Sergeant 1, Corporals 1, Drummer 1, Privates 8. Total 81. I had all the reason in the world to be perfectly satisfied with the choice of the officers. The second and third lieutenants, the lieutenant of marines, 2 of the warrant officers, and several of the petty officers, had been with me during the former voyage. The others were men of known abilities, and all of them on every occasion showed their zeal for the service in which they were employed during the whole voyage. In the equipping of these ships they were not confined to ordinary establishments, but were fitted in the most complete manner, and supplied with every extra article that was suggested to be necessary. Lord Sandwich paid an extraordinary attention to this equipment, by visiting the ships from time to time, to satisfy himself that the whole was completed to his wish, and to the satisfaction of those who were to embark in them. Nor were the Navy and Victualling Boards wanting in providing them with the very best of stores and provisions, and whatever else was necessary for so long a voyage. Some alterations were adopted in the species of provisions usually made use of in the Navy. That is, we were supplied with wheat in lieu of so much oatmeal, and sugar in lieu of so much oil, and when completed, each ship had 2 years and a half provisions on board of all species. We had besides many extra articles, such as malt, sauerkraut, salted cabbage, portable broth, saloup, mustard, marmalade of carrots, and the inspissated juice of wort and beer. Some of these articles had before been found to be highly antiscorbutic, and others were now sent out on trial, or by way of experiment. The inspissated juice of beer and wort, and marmalade of carrots especially. As several of these antiscorbutic articles are not generally known, a more particular account of them may not be amiss. Of malt is made sweet wort, which is given to such persons as have got the scurvy, or whose habit of body threatens them with it, from 1 to 5 or 6 pints a day, as the surgeon sees necessary. Sauerkraut is cabbage cut small, to which is put a little salt, juniper berries, and aniseeds. It is then fermented, and afterwards close packed in casks, in which state it will keep a good long time. This is a wholesome vegetable food, and a great antiscorbutic. The allowance to each man is 2 pounds a week, but I increased or diminished their allowance as I thought proper. Salted cabbage is cabbage cut to pieces and salted down in casks, which will preserve it a long time. Portable broth is so well known that it needs no description. We were supplied with it both for the sick and well, and it was exceedingly beneficial. Salut, and rob of lemons and oranges, were for the sick and scorbutic only, and wholly under the surgeon's care. Marmalade of carrots is the juice of yellow carrots, inspissated till it is of the thickness of fluid honey, or treacle, which last it resembles both in taste and colour. It was recommended by Baron Storch of Berlin, as a very great antiscorbutic, but we did not find that it had much of this quality. For the inspissated juice of wort and beer, we were indebted to Mr. Pelham, secretary to the commissioners of the Victualling Office. This gentleman, some years ago, considered that if the juice of malt, either as beer or wort, were inspissated by evaporation, it is probable this inspissated juice would keep good at sea, and if so, a supply of beer might be had at any time by mixing it with water. Mr. Pelham made several experiments, which succeeded so well, that the commissioners caused 31 half barrels of this juice to be prepared, and sent out with our ships for trial, 19 on board the Resolution, and the remainder on board the Adventure. The success of these experiments will be mentioned in the narrative, in the order as they were made. The frame of a small vessel, 20 tons burthen, was properly prepared and put on board each of the ships to be set up, if found necessary, to serve as tenders upon any emergency, or to transport the crew in case the ship was lost. We were also well provided with fishing nets, lines, and hooks of every kind for catching of fish; and, in order to enable us to procure refreshments in such inhabited parts of the world as we might touch at, where money was of no value, the Admiralty caused to be put on board both the ships several articles of merchandise, as well to trade with the natives for provisions, as to make them presents to gain their friendship and esteem. Their lordships also caused a number of medals to be struck, the one side representing his Majesty, and the other to the two ships. These medals were to be given to the natives of new discovered countries, and left there as testimonies of our being the first discoverers. Some additional clothing, adapted to a cold climate, was put on board, to be given to the seamen whenever it was thought necessary. In short, nothing was wanting that could tend to promote the success of the undertaking, or contribute to the conveniences and health of those who embarked in it. The Admiralty showed no less attention to science in general, by engaging Mr. William Hodges, a landscape painter, to embark in this voyage, in order to make drawings and paintings of such places in the countries we should touch at, as might be proper to give a more perfect idea thereof, than could be formed from written descriptions only. And it being thought of public utility, that some person skilled in natural history should be engaged to accompany me in this voyage, the Parliament granted an ample sum for the purpose, and Mr. John Reinhold Forster and his son were pitched upon for this employment. The Board of Longitude agreed with Mr. William Wales and Mr. William Bailey to make astronomical observations, the former on board the Resolution, and the latter on board the Adventure. The great improvements which astronomy and navigation have met with, from the many interesting observations they have made, would have done honour to any person whose reputation for mathematical knowledge was not so well known as theirs. The same board furnished them with the best instruments for making both astronomical and nautical observations and experiments, and likewise with 4 timepieces or watch machines, 3 made by Mr. Arnold, and 1 made by Mr. Kendall on Mr. Harrison's principles. A particular account of the going of these watches, as also the astronomical and nautical observations made by the astronomers, has been before the public, by order of the Board of Longitude, under the inspection of Mr. Wales. Besides the obligation I was under to this gentleman for communicating to me the observations he made, from time to time during the voyage, I have since been indebted to him for the perusal of his journal, with leave to take from it whatever I thought might contribute to the improvement of this work. For the convenience of the generality of readers, I have reduced the time from the nautical to the civil computations, so that whenever the terms AM and PM are used, the former signifies the forenoon, and the latter the afternoon of the same day. In all the courses, bearings, etc., the variation of the compass is allowed, unless the contrary is expressed. And now it may be necessary to say that, as I am on the point of sailing on a third expedition, I leave this account of my last voyage in the hands of some friends who, in my absence, have kindly accepted the office of correcting the press for me, who am pleased to think that what I have here to relate is better to be given in my own words than in the words of another person, especially as it is a work designed for information and not merely for amusement, in which it is their opinion that candour and fidelity will counterbalance the want of ornament. I shall therefore conclude this introductory discourse with desiring the reader to excuse the inaccuracies of style, which doubtless he will frequently meet with in the following narrative, and that, when such occur, he will recollect that it is the production of a man who has not had the advantage of much school education, but who has been constantly at sea from his youth, and though with the assistance of a few good friends he has passed through all the stations belonging to a seaman, from an apprentice boy in the coal trade to a post captain in the Royal Navy, he has had no opportunity of cultivating letters. After this account of myself, the public must not expect from me the elegance of a fine writer, or the plausibility of a professed bookmaker, but will, I hope, consider me as a plain man, zealously exerting himself in the service of his country, and determined to give the best account he is able of these proceedings. James Cook, Plymouth Sound, July 7th, 1776. End of introduction, part 2. Chapter 1, Part 1 of A Voyage towards the South Pole and Round the World, Volume 1, by James Cook. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by David Cole, Medway, Massachusetts. Book 1. From our departure from England to leaving the Society Isles for the first time. Chapter 1. Passage from Deptford to the Cape of Good Hope, with an account of several incidents that happened by the way, and transactions there. 1772, April. I sailed from Deptford April 9th, 1772, but got no farther than Woolwich, where I was detained by easterly winds till the 23rd, when the ship fell down to Long Reach, and the next day was joined by the Adventure. Here both ships received on board their powder, guns, gunners' stores, and marines. 1772, May. On the 10th of May we left Long Reach, with orders to touch at Plymouth, but in plying down the river the Resolution was found to be very crank, which made it necessary to put into Sheerness in order to remove this evil, by making some alteration in her upper works. These the officers of the yard were ordered to take in hand immediately, and Lord Sandwich and Sir Hugh Palliser came down to see them executed in such a manner as might effectually answer the purpose intended. 1772, June. On the 22nd of June the ship was again completed for sea, when I sailed from Sheerness, and on the 3rd of July joined the Adventure in Plymouth Sound. The evening before we met off the Sound Lord Sandwich in the Augusta yacht, who was on his return from visiting the several dockyards, with the Glory frigate and Hazard sloop. We saluted his lordship with 17 guns, and soon after he and Sir Hugh Palliser gave us the last mark of the very great attention they had paid to this equipment, by coming on board to satisfy themselves that everything was done to my wish, and that the ship was found to answer to my satisfaction. At Plymouth I received my instructions, dated the 25th of June, directing me to take under my command the Adventure, to make the best of my way to the island of Madeira, there to take in a supply of wine, and then proceed to the Cape of Good Hope, where I was to refresh the ship's companies, and take on board such provisions and necessaries as I might stand in need of. After leaving the Cape of Good Hope, I was to proceed to the southward, and endeavour to fall in with Cape Circumcision, which was said by Monsieur Bouvet to lie in the latitude of 54 south, and in about 11 degrees 20' east longitude from Greenwich. If I discovered this cape, I was to satisfy myself whether it was a part of the continent which had so much engaged the attention of geographers and former navigators, or a part of an island. If it proved to be the former, I was to employ myself diligently in exploring as great an extent of it as I could, and to make such notations thereon, and observations of every kind, as might be useful either to navigation or commerce, or tend to the promotion of natural knowledge. I was also directed to observe the genius, temper, disposition, and number of the inhabitants, if there were any, and endeavour, by all proper means, to cultivate a friendship and alliance with them, making them presents of such things as they might value, inviting them to traffic, and showing them every kind of civility and regard. I was to continue to employ myself on this service, and making discoveries either to the eastward or westward, as my situation might render most eligible, keeping in as high a latitude as I could, and prosecuting my discoveries as near to the South Pole as possible, so long as the condition of the ships, the health of the crews, and the state of their provisions would admit of, taking care to reserve as much of the latter as would enable me to reach some known port, where I was to procure a sufficiency to bring me home to England. But if Cape Circumcision should prove to be part of an island only, or if I should not be able to find the said cape, I was in the first case to make the necessary survey of the island, and then to stand on to the southward, so long as I judged there was a likelihood of falling in with the continent, which I was also to do in the latter case, and then to proceed to the eastward in further search of the said continent, as well as to make discoveries of such islands as might be situated in that unexplored part of the southern hemisphere, keeping in higher latitudes, and prosecuting my discoveries, as above mentioned, as near to the pole as possible, until I had circumnavigated the globe. After which I was to proceed to the Cape of Good Hope, and from thence to Spithead. In the prosecution of these discoveries, wherever the season of the year rendered it unsafe for me to continue in high latitudes, I was to retire to some known place to the northward, to refresh my people and refit the ships, and to return again to the southward as soon as the season of the year would admit of it. In all unforeseen cases, I was authorized to proceed according to my own discretion, and in case the Resolution should be lost or disabled, I was to prosecute the voyage on board the Adventure. I gave a copy of these instructions to Captain Furneaux, with an order directing him to carry them into execution, and in case he was separated from me, appointed the island of Madeira for the first place of rendezvous, Port Praya, in the island of St Iago, for the second, Cape of Good Hope for the third, and New Zealand for the fourth. During our stay at Plymouth, Messrs Wales and Bailey, the two astronomers, made observations on Drake's Island, in order to ascertain the latitude, longitude, and true time, for putting the timepieces and watches in motion. The latitude was found to be 50 degrees 21' 30 seconds north, and the longitude 4 degrees 20' west of Greenwich, which in this voyage is everywhere to be understood as the first meridian, and from which the longitude is reckoned east and west to 180 degrees each way. 1772 July. On the 10th of July the watches were set a-going in the presence of the two astronomers, Captain Furneaux, the first lieutenants of the ships, and myself, and put on board. The two on board the Adventure were made by Mr Arnold, and also one of those on board the Resolution, but the other was made by Mr Kendall upon the same principle in every respect as Mr Harrison's timepiece. The commander, first lieutenant, and astronomer, on board each of the ships, kept each of them keys of the boxes which contained the watches, and were always to be present at the winding them up, and comparing the one with the other; or some other officer, if at any time, through indisposition, or absence upon any other necessary duties, any of them could not conveniently attend. The same day, according to the custom of the Navy, the companies of both ships were paid 2 months' wages in advance, and, as a further encouragement of their going this extraordinary voyage, they were also paid the wages due to them to the 28th of the preceding May. This enabled them to provide necessaries for the voyage. On the 13th, at 6 o'clock in the morning, I sailed for Plymouth Sound, with the Adventure in company, and on the evening of the 29th anchored in Funchiale Road, in the island of Madeira. The next morning I saluted the garrison with 11 guns, which compliment was immediately returned. Soon after I went on shore, accompanied by Captain Furneaux, the 2 Mr Forsters, and Mr Wales. At our landing we were received by a gentleman from the vice consul, Mr Sills, who conducted us to the house of Mr Luffnans, the most considerable English merchant in the place. This gentleman not only obtained leave for Mr Forster to search the island for plants, but procured us every other thing we wanted, and insisted on our accommodating ourselves at his house during our stay. The town of Funchiale, which is the capital of the island, is situated about the middle of the south side, in the bottom of the bay of the same name, in latitude 32 degrees 33 minutes 34 seconds north, longitude 17 degrees 12 7/8 seconds west. The longitude was deduced from lunar observations made by Mr Wales, and reduced to the town by Mr Kendall's watch, which made the longitude 17 degrees 10 minutes 14 seconds west. During our stay here, the crews of both ships were supplied with fresh beef and onions, and a quantity of the latter was distributed among them for a sea store. 1772 August. Having got on board a supply of water, wine, and other necessaries, we left Madeira on the 1st of August, and stood to the southward with a fine gale at northeast. On the 4th we passed Palma, one of the Canary Isles. It is of a height to be seen 12 or 14 leagues, and lies in the latitude 28 degrees 38 minutes north, longitude 17 degrees 58 minutes west. The next day we saw the Isle of Ferro, and passed it at a distance of 14 leagues. I judged it to lie in the latitude of 27 degrees 42 minutes north, and longitude 18 degrees 9 minutes west. I now made 3 puncheons of beer of the inspissated juice of malt. The proportion I made use of was about 10 of water to 1 of juice. 15 of the 19 half barrels of the inspissated juice, which we had on board, were produced from wort, that was hopped before inspissated. The other 4 were made of beer, that had been both hopped and fermented before inspissated. This last requires no other preparation to make it fit for use, than to mix it with cold water, from 1 part in 8 to 1 part in 12 of water, or in such other proportion as might be liked, then stop it down, and in a few days it will be brisk and drinkable. But the other sort, after being mixed with water in the same manner, will require to be fermented with yeast, in the usual way of making beer. At least it was so thought. However, experience taught us that this will not always be necessary, for by the heat of the weather, and the agitation of the ship, both sorts were at this time in the highest state of fermentation, and had hitherto evaded all our endeavours to stop it. If this juice could be kept from fermenting, it certainly would be a most valuable article at sea. On finding that our stock of water would not last as to the Cape of Good Hope, without putting the people to a scanty allowance, I resolved to stop at St Jago for a supply. On the 9th, at 9 o'clock in the morning, we made the island of Bonavista, bearing south-west. The next day we passed the Isle of Mayo on the right, and the same evening anchored in Port Praya, in the island of St Jago, in 18 fathoms water. The east point of the bay bore east, the west point south-west a half south, and the fort north-west. I immediately dispatched an officer to ask leave to water and purchase refreshments, which was granted. On the return of the officer, I saluted the fort with 11 guns, on the promise of its being returned with an equal number. But by a mistake, as they pretended, the salute was returned with only 9, for which the governor made an excuse the next day. The 14th, in the evening, having completed our water, and got on board a supply of refreshments, such as hogs, goats, fowls, and fruit, we put to sea and proceeded on our voyage. Port Praya is in a small bay, situated about the middle of the south side of the island of St Jago, in the latitude of 14 degrees 53 minutes 30 seconds north, longitude 23 degrees 30 minutes west. It may be known, especially in coming from the east, by the southernmost hill on the island, which is round and peaked at top, and lies a little way inland, in the direction of west from the port. This mark is the more necessary, as there is a small cove about a league to the eastward, with a sandy beach in the bottom of it, a valley, and cocoa-nut trees behind, which strangers may mistake for Port Praya, as we ourselves did. The 2 points which form the entrance of Port Praya Bay are rather low, and in the direction of west-south-west and east-north-east, half a league from each other. Close to the west point are sunken rocks, on which the sea continually breaks. The bay lies in north-west near half a league, and the depth of water is from 14 to 4 fathoms. Large ships ought not to anchor in less than 8, in which depth the south end of the Green Island, a small island lying under the west shore, will bear west. You water at a well that is behind the beach at the head of the bay. The water is tolerable but scarce, and bad getting off, on account of a great surf on the beach. The refreshments to be got here are bullocks, hogs, goat, sheep, poultry, and fruits. The goats are of the antelope kind, so extraordinarily lean that hardly anything can equal them, and the bullocks, hogs, and sheep are not much better. Bullocks must be purchased with money. The price is 12 Spanish dollars a head, weighing between 250 and 300 pounds. Other articles may be got from the natives in exchange for old clothes, etc. But the sale of bullocks is confined to a company of merchants, to whom this privilege is granted, and who keep an agent residing upon the spot. The fort above mentioned seems wholly designed for the protection of the bay, and is well situated for that purpose, being built on an elevation which rises directly from the sea on the right, at the head of the bay. We had no sooner got clear of Port Praya than we got a fresh gale at N.N.E., which blew in squalls, attended with showers of rain. But the next day the wind and showers abated, and veered to the south. It was, however, variable and unsettled for several days, accompanied with dark gloomy weather and showers of rain. On the 19th, in the afternoon, one of the carpenter's mates fell overboard and was drowned. He was over the side, fitting in one of the scuttles, from whence it is supposed he had fallen, for he was not seen till the very instant he sunk under the ship's stern, when our endeavours to save him were too late. This loss was sensibly felt during the voyage, as he was a sober man and a good workman. About noon the next day the rain poured down upon us, not in drops but in streams. The wind, at the same time, was variable and squally, which obliged the people to attend the decks, so that few in the ships escaped a good soaking. We, however, benefited by it, as it gave us an opportunity of filling all our empty water casks. This heavy rain at last brought on a dead calm, which continued 24 hours, when it was succeeded by a breeze from south-west betwixt this point and south. It continued for several days, and blew at times in squalls, attended with rain and hot sultry weather. The mercury in the thermometers at noon kept generally from 79 to 82. On the 27th spoke with Captain Furneaux, who informed us that one of his petty officers was dead. At this time we had not one sick on board, although we had every thing of this kind to fear from the rain we had had, which is a great promoter of sickness in hot climates. To prevent this, and agreeable to some hints I had from Sir Hugh Palliser and from Captain Campbell, I took every necessary precaution by airing and drying the ship, with fires made betwixt decks, smoking, etc., and by obliging the people to air their bedding, wash and dry their clothes, whenever there was an opportunity. A neglect of these things causeth a disagreeable smell below, affects the air, and seldom fails to bring on sickness, but more especially in hot and wet weather. We now began to see some of those birds which are said never to fly far from land, that is, man-of-war and tropic birds, gannets, etc. No land, however, that we knew of, could be nearer than 80 leagues. On the 30th at noon, being in the latitude of 2 degrees 35 minutes north, longitude 7 degrees 30 minutes west, and the wind having veered to the east of south, we tacked and stretched to the southwest. In the latitude of 0 degrees 52 minutes north, longitude 9 degrees 25 minutes west, we had one calm day, which gave us an opportunity of trying the current in a boat. We found it set to the north 1/3 of a mile an hour. We had reason to expect this, from the difference we frequently found between the observed latitude and that given by the log, and Mr Kendall's watch shewed us that it was set to the east also. This was fully confirmed by the lunar observations, when it appeared that we were 3 degrees 0 minutes more to the east than the common reckoning. At the time of trying the current, the mercury in the thermometer in the open air stood at 75.5, and when immersed in the surface of the sea at 74, but when immersed 80 fathoms deep, where it remained 15 minutes, when it came up, the mercury stood at 66. At the same time we sounded, without our finding the bottom, with a line of 250 fathoms. The calm was succeeded by a light breeze at southwest, which kept veering by little and little to the south, and at last to the eastward of south, attended with clear serene weather. End of Book 1, Chapter 1, Part 1. Chapter 1, Part 2 of A Voyage towards the South Pole and Round the World, Volume 1, by James Cook. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by David Cole, Medway, Massachusetts. Chapter 1. Passage from Deptford to the Cape of Good Hope, Part 2. 1772, September. At length, on the 8th of September, we crossed the line in the longitude of 8 degrees west, after which the ceremony of ducking, etc., generally practised on this occasion, was not omitted. The wind now veering more and more to the east, and blowing a gentle top-gallant gale, in 8 days it carried us into the latitude 9 degrees 30 minutes south, longitude 18 degrees west. The weather was pleasant, and we daily saw some of those birds which are looked upon as signs of the vicinity of land, such as boobies, man-of-war, tropic birds, and gannets. We supposed they came from the Isle of St. Matthew or Ascension, which isles we must have passed at no great distance. On the 27th, in the latitude of 25 degrees 29 minutes, longitude 24 degrees 54 minutes, we discovered a sail to the west standing after us. She was a snow, and the colours she shewed, either a Portuguese or St. George's ensign, the distance being too great to distinguish the one from the other, and I did not choose to wait to get nearer, or to speak with her. The wind now began to be variable. It first veered to the north, where it remained 2 days with fair weather. Afterwards it came round by the west to the south, where it remained 2 days longer, and, after a few hours calm, sprung up at south-west. But here it remained not long, before it veered to south-south-east, and to the north of east. Blew fresh, and by squalls, with showers of rain. 1772 October. With these winds we advanced but slowly, and, without meeting with anything remarkable, till the 11th of October, when, at 6 hours 24 minutes 12 seconds, by Mr. Kendall's watch, the moon rose about 4 digits eclipsed, and soon after we prepared to observe the end of the eclipse, as follows: by me at 6 hours 53 minutes 51 seconds, with a common refractor. By Mr. Forster 6 hours 55 minutes 23 seconds. By Mr. Wales 6 hours 54 minutes 57 seconds, quadrant telescope. By Mr. Pickersgill 6 hours 55 minutes 30 seconds, 3 feet refractor. By Mr. Gillett 6 hours 53 minutes 24 seconds, naked eye. By Mr. Hervey 6 hours 55 minutes 34 seconds, quadrant telescope. Mean 6 hours 54 minutes 46.5 seconds by the watch. Watch slow of apparent time 3 minutes 59 seconds. Apparent time 6 hours 58 minutes 45.5 seconds, end of the eclipse. Ditto 7 hours 25 minutes 0 seconds at Greenwich. Difference of longitude 0 hours 26 minutes 14.5 seconds, equivalent to 6 degrees 33 minutes 30 seconds of longitude. The longitude observed by Mr. Wales was, by the moon and Aquilae, 5 degrees 51 minutes, by the moon and Aldebaran, 6 degrees 35 minutes. Mean 6 degrees 13 minutes 0 seconds. By Mr. Kendall's watch 6 degrees 53 7/8 minutes. The next morning, having but little wind, we hoisted a boat out, to try if there was any current, but found none. From this time to the 16th, we had the wind between the north and east, a gentle gale. We had for some time ceased to see any of the birds before mentioned, and were now accompanied by albatrosses, pintadoes, shearwaters, etc., and a small grey petrel, less than a pigeon. It had a whitish belly and grey back, with a black stroke across from the tip of one wing to the tip of the other. These birds sometimes visited us in great flights. They are, as well as the pintadoes, southern birds, and are, I believe, never seen within the tropics, or north of the Line. On the 17th we saw a sail to the northwest, standing to the eastward, which hoisted Dutch colours. She kept us company for 2 days, but the 3rd we outsailed her. On the 21st, at 7 hours 30 minutes 20 seconds a.m., our longitude, by the mean of 2 observed distances of the sun and moon, was 8 degrees 4 minutes 30 seconds east. Mr. Kendall's watch at the same time gave 7 degrees 22 minutes. Our latitude was 35 degrees 20 seconds north. The wind was now easterly, and continued on till the 23rd, when it veered to the north and northwest, after some hours calm, in which we put a boat in the water, and Mr. Forster shot some albatrosses and other birds, on which we feasted the next day, and found them exceedingly good. At the same time we saw a seal, or, as some thought, a sea lion, which probably might be an inhabitant of one of the isles of Tristan da Cunha, being now nearly in their latitude, and about 5° east of them. The wind continued but 2 days at N.W. and S.W., then veered to the S.E., where it remained 2 days longer, then fixed at N.W., which carried us to our intended port. As we approached the land, the sea fowl, which had accompanied us hitherto, began to leave us; at least they did not come in such numbers, nor did we see gannets, or the black bird, commonly called the Cape hen, till we were nearly within sight of the Cape; nor did we strike sounding until Penguin Island bore N.N.E., distant 2 or 3 leagues, where we had 50 fathom water. Not but that the soundings might extend farther off. However, I am very sure that they do not extend very far west from the Cape; for we could not find ground with a line of 210 fathoms, 25 leagues west of Table Bay, the same at 35 leagues, and at 64 leagues. I sounded these 3 times, in order to find a bank, which, I had been told, lies to the west of the Cape, but how far I never could learn. I was told before I left England, by some gentlemen who were well enough acquainted with the navigation between England and the Cape of Good Hope, that we sailed at an improper season of the year, and that I should meet with much calm weather near and under the line. This probably may be the case some years; it is, however, not general. On the contrary, we hardly met with any calms, but a brisk S.W. wind in those very latitudes where the calms are expected; nor did we meet with any of those tornadoes so much spoken of by other navigators. However, what they have said of the current setting towards the coast of Guinea, as you approach that shore, is true; for, from the time of our leaving St Jago, to our arrival in the latitude of 1½ north, which was 11 days, we were carried by the current 3 degrees of longitude more east than our reckoning. On the other hand, after we had crossed the line, and got to the S.E. trade wind, we always found by observation, that the ship outstripped the reckoning, which we judged to be owing to a current setting between the south and west. But on the whole, the currents in this run seemed to balance each other, for upon our arrival at the Cape, the difference of longitude by dead reckoning kept from England, without once being corrected, was only 3/4 degree less than that by observation. At 2 in the afternoon on the 29th, we made the land of the Cape of Good Hope. The Table Mountain, which is over the Cape Town, bore east-south-E, distance 12 or 14 leagues. At this time it was a good deal obscured by clouds, otherwise it might, from its height, have been seen at a much greater distance. We now crowded all the sail we could, thinking to get into the bay before dark; but when we found this could not be accomplished, we shortened sail, and spent the night standing off and on. Between 8 and 9 o'clock, the whole sea, within the compass of our sight, became at once, as it were, illuminated, or what the seamen call all on fire. This appearance of the sea, in some degree, is very common, but the cause is not so generally known. Mr Banks and Dr Solander had satisfied me it was occasioned by sea insects. Mr Forster, however, seemed not to favour this opinion. I therefore had some buckets of water drawn up from alongside the ship, which we found full of an innumerable quantity of small globular insects, about the size of a common pin's head, and quite transparent. There was no doubt of their being living animals when in their own proper element, though we could not perceive any life in them. Mr Forster, whose province it is more minutely to describe things of this nature, was now well satisfied with the cause of the sea's illumination. At length daylight came and brought us fair weather, and having stood into Table Bay with the Adventure in company, we anchored in 5 fathom water. We afterwards moored N.E. and S.W., Green Point on the west point of the bay, bearing N.W. by W., and the church, in one with the valley between the Table Mountain and the Sugarloaf, or Lion's Head, bearing S.W. by S., and distant from the landing place near the fort 1 mile. We had no sooner anchored than we were visited by the captain of the port, or master attendant, some other officers belonging to the company, and Mr. Brant. This last gentleman brought us off such things as could not fail of being acceptable to persons coming from sea. The purport of the master attendant's visit was, according to custom, to take an account of the ships, to inquire into the health of the crews, and in particular if the small pox was on board, a thing they dread above all others at the Cape, and for these purposes a surgeon is always one of the visitants. My first step after anchoring was, to send an officer to wait on Baron Plattenberg, the governor, to acquaint him with our arrival, and the reasons which induced me to put in there. To this the officer received a very polite answer, and upon his return we saluted the garrison with 11 guns, which compliment was returned. Soon after I went on shore myself, and waited upon the governor, accompanied by Captain Furneaux and the 2 Mr. Forsters. He received us with very great politeness, and promised me every assistance the place could afford. From him I learned that 2 French ships from the Mauritius, about 8 months before, had discovered land in the latitude of 48° south, and in the meridian of that island, along which they sailed 40 miles, till they came to a bay in which they were about to enter, when they were driven off and separated in a hard gale of wind, after having lost some of their boats and people, which they had sent to sound the bay. One of the ships, viz. La Fortune, soon after arrived at the Mauritius, the captain of which was sent home to France with an account of the discovery. The governor also informed me that in March last 2 other French ships from the island of Mauritius touched at the Cape, in their way to the South Pacific Ocean, where they were going to make discoveries, under the command of Monsieur Marion. Aituro, the man Monsieur de Bougainville brought from Otaheite, was to have returned with Monsieur Marion, had he been living. After having visited the governor and some other principal persons of the place, we fixed ourselves at Mr. Brant's, the usual residence of most officers belonging to English ships. This gentleman spares neither trouble nor expense to make his home agreeable to those who favour him with their company, and to accommodate them with every thing they want. With him I concerted measures for supplying the ships with provisions, and all other necessaries they wanted, which he set about procuring without delay, while the seamen on board were employed in overhauling the rigging, and the carpenters in caulking the ship's sides and decks, etc. Messrs. Wales and Bailey got all their instruments on shore, in order to make astronomical observations, for ascertaining the going of the watches and other purposes. The results of some of these observations shewed, that Mr. Kendall's watch had answered beyond all expectations, by pointing out the longitude of this place to within 1 minute of time to what it was observed by Messrs. Mason and Dixon in 1761. 3 or 4 days after us, 2 Dutch Indiamen arrived here from Holland, after a passage of between 4 and 5 months, in which one lost, by the scurvy and other putrid diseases, 150 men, and the other 41. They sent, on their arrival, great numbers to the hospital in very dreadful circumstances. It is remarkable that one of these ships touched at Port Praya, and left it a month before we arrived there, and yet we got here 3 days before her. The Dutch at the Cape, having found their hospital too small for the reception of their sick, were going to build a new one at the east part of the town, the foundation of which was laid with great ceremony while we were there. 1772 November. By the healthy condition of the crews of both ships at our arrival, I thought to have made my stay at the Cape very short; but as the bread we wanted was unbaked, and the spirit, which I found scarce, to be collected from different parts out of the country, it was the 18th of November before we had got every thing on board, and the 22nd before we could put to sea. During this stay, the crews of both ships were served every day with fresh beef or mutton, new baked bread, and as much greens as they could eat. The ships were caulked and painted, and in every respect put in as good a condition as when they left England. Some alterations in the officers took place in the Adventure. Mr. Shank, the first lieutenant, having been in an ill state of health ever since we sailed from Plymouth, and not finding himself recovering here, desired my leave to quit, in order to return home for the re-establishment of his health. As his request appeared to be well founded, I granted him leave accordingly, and appointed Mr. Kemp first lieutenant in his room, and Mr. Burney, one of my midshipmen, second in the room of Mr. Kemp. Mr. Forster, whose whole time was taken up in the pursuit of natural history and botany, met with a Swedish gentleman, one Mr. Sparman, who understood something of these sciences, having studied under Dr. Linnaeus. He being willing to embark with us, Mr. Forster strongly importuned me to take him on board, thinking he would be of great assistance to him in the course of the voyage. I at last consented, and he embarked with us accordingly, as an assistant to Mr. Forster, who bore his expenses on board, and allowed him a yearly stipend besides. Mr. Hodges employed himself here in drawing a view of the Cape Town, and parts adjacent, in oil colours, which was properly packed up with some others, and left with Mr. Brandt, in order to be forwarded to the Admiralty by the first ship that should sail for England. End of Chapter 1, Part 2. Chapter 2, Part 1 of A Voyage towards the South Pole and Round the World, Volume 1, by James Cook. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by David Cole, Medway, Massachusetts. Chapter 2. Departure from the Cape of Good Hope, in search of a southern continent. 1772 November. Having at length finished my business at the Cape, and taken leave of the governor and some others of the chief officers, who, with very obliging readiness, had given me all the assistance I could desire, on the 22nd of November we repaired on board, and at 3 o'clock in the afternoon weighed, and came to sail with the wind at north by west. As soon as the anchor was up, we saluted the port with 15 guns, which was immediately returned, and after making a few trips, got out of the bay by 7 o'clock, at which time the town bore south-east, distant 4 miles. After this we stood to the westward all night, in order to get clear of the land, having the wind at N.N.W. and N.W., blowing in squalls attended with rain, which obliged us to reef our topsails. The sea was again illuminated for some time, in the same manner as it was the night before we arrived in Table Bay. Having got clear of the land, I directed my course for Cape Circumcision. The wind continued at N.W. a moderate gale until the 24th, when it veered round to the eastward. On the noon of this day, we were in the latitude of 35 degrees 25 minutes south, and 29 minutes west of the Cape. and had abundance of albatrosses about us, several of which were caught with hook and line, and were very well relished by many of the people, notwithstanding they were at this time served with fresh mutton. Judging that we should soon come into cold weather, I ordered slops to be served to such as were in want, and gave each man the fear nought jacket and trousers allowed them by the Admiralty. 1772 December. The wind continued easterly for 2 days, and blew a moderate gale, which brought us into the latitude of 39 degrees 4 minutes, and 2 degrees of longitude west of the Cape. Thermometer 52.5. The wind now came to west and southwest, and on the 29th fixed at west-northwest, and increased to a storm, which continued with some few intervals of moderate weather till the 6th of December, when we were in the latitude of 48 degrees 41 minutes south, and longitude 18 degrees 24 minutes east. This gale, which was attended with rain and hail, blew at times with such violence that we could carry no sails, by which means we were driven far to the eastward of our intended course, and no hopes were left me of reaching Cape Circumcision. But the greatest misfortune that attended us was the loss of a great part of our livestock, which we had brought from the Cape, and which consisted of sheep, hogs, and geese. Indeed, this sudden transition from warm, mild weather to extreme cold and wet made every man in the ship feel its effects; for by this time the mercury in the thermometer had fallen to 38, whereas at the Cape it was generally at 67 and upwards. I now made some addition to the people's allowance of spirit, by giving them a dram whenever I thought it necessary, and ordered Captain Furneaux to do the same. The night proved clear and serene, and the only one that was so since we left the Cape, and the next morning the rising sun gave us such flattering hopes of a fine day, that we were induced to let all the reefs out of the topsails, and to get top-gallant yards across, in order to make the most of a fresh gale at north. Our hopes, however, soon vanished, for before 8 o'clock the serenity of the sky was changed into a thick haze, accompanied with rain. The gale increasing obliged us to hand the mainsail, close reef our topsails, and to strike top-gallant yards. The barometer at this time was unusually low, which foreboded an approaching storm, and this happened accordingly; for, by 1 o'clock p.m., the wind, which was at northwest, blew with such strength as obliged us to take in all our sails, to strike top-gallant masts, and to get the spritsail yard in; and I thought proper to wear and lie to under a mizzen staysail, with the ship's heads to the northeast, as they would bow the sea, which ran prodigiously high, better on this tack. At 8 o'clock next morning, being the 8th, we wore and lay on the other tack. The gale was a little abated, but the sea ran too high to make sail, any more than the fore topmast staysail. In the evening, being in the latitude of 49 degrees 40 minutes south, and 1½ degrees east of the Cape, we saw 2 penguins and some sea or rockweed, which occasioned us to sound, without finding ground at 100 fathoms. At 8 p.m. we wore, and lay with our heads to the northeast till 3 in the morning of the 9th, then wore again to the southward, the wind blowing in squalls accompanied with showers of snow. At 8, being something more moderate, I made the Adventure signal to make sail, and soon after made sail ourselves under the courses and close reefed topsails. In the evening took in the topsails and mainsail, and brought to under foresail and mizzen, thermometer at 36 degrees. The wind still at northwest, blew a fresh gale, accompanied with a very high sea. In the night we had a pretty smart frost with snow. In the morning of the 10th we made sail under courses and topsails close reefed, and made the signal for the Adventure to make sail and lead. At 8 o'clock saw an island of ice to the westward of us, being then in the latitude of 56 degrees 40 minutes south, and longitude 2 degrees 0 minutes east of the Cape of Good Hope. Soon after the wind moderated, and we let all the reefs out of the topsails, got the spritsail yard out, and topgallant mast up. The weather coming hazy, I called the Adventure by signal under my stern, which was no sooner done than the haze increased so much with snow and sleet, that we did not see an island of ice, which we were steering directly for, till we were less than a mile from it. I judged it to be about 50 feet high, and half a mile in circuit. It was flat on top, and its sides rose in a perpendicular direction, against which the seas broke exceedingly high. Captain Furneaux at first took this ice for land, and hauled off from it, until called back by signal. As the weather was foggy, it was necessary to proceed with caution. We therefore reefed our topsails, and at the same time sounded, but found no ground with 150 fathoms. We kept on to the southward, with the wind at north till night, which we spent in making short trips, first one way and then another, under an easy sail. Thermometer these 24 hours from 36.5 to 31. At daylight in the morning of the 11th, we made sail to the southward with the wind at west, having a fresh gale attended with sleet and snow. At noon we were in the latitude of 51 degrees 50 minutes south, and longitude 21 degrees 3 minutes east, where we saw some white birds about the size of pigeons, with blackish bills and feet. I never saw any such before, and Mr. Forster had no knowledge of them. I believe them to be of the petrel tribe, and natives of these icy seas. At this time we passed between two ice islands, which lay at a little distance from each other. In the night the wind veered to northwest, which enabled us to see a southwest. On the 12th we had still thick hazy weather, with sleet and snow, so that we were obliged to proceed with great caution on account of the ice islands. 6 of these we passed this day, some of them near 2 miles in circuit and 60 feet high. And yet such was the force and height of the waves, that the sea broke quite over them. This exhibited a view, which for a few moments was pleasing to the eye, but when we reflected on the danger, the mind was filled with horror. For were a ship to get against the weather side of one of these islands when the sea runs high, she would be dashed to pieces in a moment. Upon our getting among the ice islands, the albatrosses left us, that is, we saw but one now and then, nor did our other companions, the pintadoes, sheerwaters, small grey birds, fulmars, etc., appear in such numbers. On the other hand, penguins began to make their appearance. 2 of these birds were seen to-day. The wind in the night veered to west, and at last fixed at southwest, a fresh gale, with sleet and snow, which froze on our sails and rigging as it fell, so that they were all hung with icicles. We kept on to the southward, passed no less than 18 ice islands, and saw more penguins. At noon on the 13th, we were in the latitude of 54 degrees south, which is the latitude of Cape Circumcision, discovered by Monsieur Bouvet in 1739, but we were 10 degrees of longitude east of it, that is near 118 leagues in this latitude. We stood on to the south-south-east till 8 o'clock in the evening, the weather still continuing thick and hazy, with sleet and snow. From noon till this time, 20 ice islands, of various extent, both for height and circuit, presented themselves to our view. At 8 o'clock we sounded, but found no ground with 150 fathom of line. We now tacked and made a trip to the northward till midnight, when we stood again to the southward, and at half an hour past 6 in the morning of the 14th, we were stopped by an immense field of low ice, to which we could see no end, either to the east, west, or south. In different parts of this field were islands or hills of ice, like those we found floating in the sea, and some on board thought they saw land also over the ice, bearing S.W. by S. I even thought so myself, but changed my opinion upon more narrowly examining these ice hills, and the various appearances they made when seen through the haze. For at this time it was both hazy and cloudy in the horizon, so that a distant object could not be seen distinct. Being now in the latitude of 54 degrees 50 minutes south, and longitude 21 degrees 34 minutes east, and having the wind at northwest, we bore away along the edge of the ice, steering south-south-east and south-east, according to the direction of the north side of it, where we saw many whales, penguins, some white birds, pintadoes, etc. At 8 o'clock we brought to under a point of the ice, where we had smooth water, and I sent on board for Captain Furneaux. After we had fixed on rendezvous, in case of separation, and some other matters for the better keeping company, he returned on board, and we made sail again along the ice. Some pieces we took up alongside, which yielded fresh water. At noon we had a good observation, and found ourselves in latitude 54 degrees 55 minutes south. We continued a south-east course along the edge of the ice till 1 o'clock, when we came to a point round which we hauled south-south-west, the sea appearing to be clear of ice in that direction. But after running 4 leagues upon this course, with the ice on our starboard side, we found ourselves quite embayed, the ice extending from north-north-east round by the west and south to east, in one compact body. The weather was indifferently clear, and yet we could see no end to it. At 5 o'clock we hauled up east, wind at north, a gentle gale, in order to clear the ice. The extreme east point of it at 8 o'clock bore east by south, over which appeared a clear sea. We however spent the night in making short boards under an easy sail. Thermometer these 24 hours, from 32 to 30. Next day, the 15th, we had the wind at northwest, a small gale, thick foggy weather with much snow. Thermometer from 32 to 27, so that our sails and rigging were all hung with icicles. The fog was so thick at times that we could not see the length of the ship, and we had much difficulty to avoid the many islands of ice that surrounded us. About noon, having but little wind, we hoisted out a boat to try the current, which we found set south-east, near 3/4 miles an hour. At the same time a thermometer, which in the open air was at 32 degrees, in the surface of the sea was at 30 degrees, and after being immerged 100 fathoms deep for about 15 or 20 minutes, came up at 34 degrees, which is only 2 degrees above freezing. Our latitude at this time was 55 degrees 8 minutes. The thick fog continued till 2 o'clock in the afternoon of the next day, when it cleared away a little, and we made sail to the southward, wind still at northwest, a gentle gale. We had not run long to the southward, before we fell in with a main field of ice, extending from south-southwest to east. We now bore away to east along the edge of it, but at night hauled off north, with the wind at west-northwest, a gentle gale attended with snow. At 4 in the morning on the 17th, stood again to the south, but was again obliged to bear up on account of the ice, along the side of which we steered betwixt east and south-southwest, hauling into every bay or opening, in hopes of finding a passage to the south, but we found everywhere the ice closed. We had a gentle gale at northwest, with showers of snow. At noon we were by observation in the latitude of 55 degrees 16 minutes south. In the evening the weather was clear and serene. In the course of this day we saw many whales, one seal, penguins, some of the white birds, another sort of petrel, which is brown and white, and not much unlike a pintado, and some other sorts already known. We found the skirts of the loose ice to be more broken than usual, and it extended some distance beyond the main field, insomuch that we sailed amongst it the most part of the day, and the high ice islands without us were innumerable. At 8 o'clock we sounded, but found no ground with 250 fathoms of line. After this we hauled close upon a wind to the northward, as we could see the field of ice extend as far as northeast. But this happened not to be the northern point, for at 11 o'clock we were obliged to tack to avoid it. At 2 o'clock the next morning we stood again to the northward, with the wind at northwest by west, thinking to weather the ice upon this tack, on which we stood but 2 hours, before we found ourselves quite embayed, being then in latitude 55 degrees 8 minutes, longitude 24 degrees 3 minutes. The wind veering more to the north, we tacked and stood to the westward, under all the sail we could carry, having a fresh breeze and clear weather, which last was of short duration. For at 6 o'clock it became hazy, and soon after there was thick fog. The wind veered to the northeast, freshened and brought with it snow and sleet, which froze on the rigging as it fell. We were now enabled to get clear of the field of ice, but at the same time we were carried in amongst the ice islands in a manner equally dangerous, and which with much difficulty we kept clear of. Dangerous as it is to sail among these floating rocks, if I may be allowed to call them so, in a thick fog, this, however, is preferable to being entangled with immense fields of ice under the same circumstances. The great danger to be apprehended in the latter case is the getting fast in the ice, a situation which would be extremely alarming. I had 2 men on board that had been in the Greenland trade, the one of them in a ship that lay 9 weeks, and the other in one that lay 6 weeks, fast in this kind of ice, which they called packed ice. What they called field ice is thicker, and the whole field, be it ever so large, consists of one piece; whereas this which I call field ice, from its immense extent, consists of many pieces of various sizes, both in thickness and surface, from 30 or 40 feet square to 3 or 4, packed close together, and in places heaped one upon another. This, I am of opinion, would be found too hard for a ship's side, that is not properly armed against it. How long it may have lain, or will lie here, is a point not easily determined. Such ice is found in the Greenland seas all the summer long, and I think it cannot be colder there in the summer than it is here. Be this as it may, we certainly had no thaw. On the contrary, the mercury in Fahrenheit's thermometer kept generally below the freezing point, although it was the middle of summer. It is a general opinion that the ice I have been speaking of is formed in bays and rivers. Under this supposition, we were led to believe that land was not far distant, and that it even lay to the southward behind the ice, which alone hindered us from approaching to it. Therefore, as we had now sailed above 30 leagues along the edge of the ice, without finding a passage to the south, I determined to run 30 or 40 leagues to the east, afterwards endeavour to get to the southward, and if I met with no land or other impediment, to get behind the ice, and put the matter out of all manner of dispute. With this view we kept standing to the northwest, with the wind at northeast and north, thick foggy weather, with sleet and snow, till 6 in the evening, when the wind veered to northwest, and we tacked and stood to the eastward, meeting with many islands of ice of different magnitudes, and some loose pieces. The thermometer from 30 to 34, weather very hazy with sleet and snow, and more sensibly colder than the thermometer seemed to point out, insomuch that the whole crew complained. In order to enable them to support this weather the better, I caused the sleeves of their jackets, which were so short as to expose their arms, to be lengthened with baize, and had a cap made for each man of the same stuff, together with canvas, which proved of great service to them. Some of our people appearing to have symptoms of the scurvy, the surgeons began to give them fresh wort every day, made from the malt we had on board for that purpose. One man in particular was highly scorbutic, and yet he had been taking the rob of lemon and orange for some time, without being benefited thereby. On the other hand, Captain Furneaux told me that he had 2 men, who, though far gone in this disease, were now in a manner entirely cured by it. We continued standing to the eastward till 8 o'clock in the morning of the 21st, when, being in the latitude of 53 degrees 50 minutes, and longitude 29 degrees 24 minutes east, we hauled to the south, with the wind at west, a fresh gale and hazy with snow. In the evening the wind fell and the weather cleared up, so as that we could see a few leagues round us, being in the latitude of 54 degrees 43 minutes south, longitude 29 degrees 30 minutes east. At 10 o'clock, seeing many islands of ice ahead, and the weather coming on foggy with snow, we wore and stood to the northward till 3 in the morning, when we stood again to the south. At 8 the weather cleared up, and the wind came to W.S.W., with which we made all the sail we could to the south, having never less than 10 or 12 islands of ice in sight. Next day we had the wind at S.W. and S.S.W., a gentle gale, with now and then showers of snow and hail. In the morning, being in the latitude of 55 degrees 20 minutes south, and longitude 31 degrees 30 minutes east, we hoisted out a boat to see if there was any current, but found none. Mr. Forster, who went in the boat, shot some of the small grey birds before mentioned, which were of the petrel tribe, and about the size of a small pigeon. Their back and upper side of their wings, their feet and bills, are of a blue-grey colour. Their bellies and under side of their wings are white, a little tinged with blue. The upper side of their quill feathers is a dark blue tinged with black. A streak is formed by feathers nearly of this colour, along the upper parts of the wings, and crossing the back a little above the tail. The end of the tail feathers is also of the same colour. Their bills are much broader than any I have seen of the same tribe, and their tongues are remarkably broad. These blue petrels, as I shall call them, are seen nowhere but in the southern hemisphere, from about the latitude of 28 degrees and upwards. Thermometer at 33 degrees in the open air, and 32 degrees in the sea at the surface, and at 34½ when drawn, and 6½ minutes in drawing up from 100 fathoms below it, where it had been 16 minutes. On the 24th the wind blew from N.W. to N.E. a gentle gale, fair and cloudy. At noon we were by observation in the latitude of 56 degrees 31 minutes south, and longitude 31 degrees 19 minutes east, the thermometer at 35. And being near an island of ice, which was about 50 feet high and 400 fathoms in circuit, I sent the master in the jolly boat to see if any water ran from it. He soon returned with an account that there was not one drop, or any other appearance of thaw. In the evening we sailed through several floats, or fields of loose ice, lying in the direction of southeast and northwest. At the same time we had continually several islands of the same composition in sight. On the 25th, the wind veering round from the northeast to the east by south, it blew a gentle gale, with which we stood to the W.S.W., and at noon were in the latitude of 57 degrees 50 minutes south, and longitude 29 degrees 32 minutes east. The weather was fair and cloudy, the air sharp and cold, attended with a hard frost; and although this was the middle of summer with us, I much question if the day was colder in any part of England. The wind continued at south, blew a fresh gale, fair and cloudy weather till near noon the next day, when we had clear sunshine, and found ourselves by observation in the latitude of 58° 31' south, longitude 26° 57' east. In the course of the last 24 hours, we passed through several fields of broken loose ice. They were in general narrow, but of a considerable length, in the direction of N.W. and S.E. The ice was so close in one, that it would hardly admit the ship through it. The pieces were flat, from 4 to 6 or 8 inches thick, and appeared of that sort of ice which is generally formed in bays or rivers. Others again were different, the pieces forming various honeycombed branches, exactly like coral rocks, and exhibiting such a variety of figures as can hardly be conceived. We supposed this ice to have broke from the main field we had lately left, and which I was determined to get to the south of, or behind if possible, in order to satisfy myself whether or not it joined to any land, as had been conjectured. With this view I kept on to the westward, with a gentle gale at south and south-south-west, and soon after 6 o'clock in the evening we saw some penguins, which occasioned us to sound, but we found no ground with 150 fathoms. In the morning of the 27th we saw more loose ice, but not many islands, and those we did see were but small. The day being calm and pleasant, and the sea smooth, we hoisted out a boat, from which Mr Forster shot a penguin and some peterels. These penguins differ not from those seen in other parts of the world, except in some minute particulars distinguishable only by naturalists. Some of the peterels were of the blue sort, but differed from those before mentioned, in not having a broad bill, and the ends of their tail feathers were tipped with white instead of dark blue; but whether these were only the distinctions betwixt the male and female, was a matter disputed by naturalists. We were now in the latitude of 58° 19' south, longitude 24° 39' east, and took the opportunity of the calm to sound, but found no ground with a line of 220 fathoms. The calm continued until 6 in the evening, when it was succeeded by a light breeze from the east, which afterwards increased to a fresh gale. In the morning of the 28th I made the signal to the Adventure to spread 4 miles on my starboard beam, and in this position we continued sailing west-south-west till 4 o'clock in the afternoon, when the hazy weather, attended with snow showers, made it necessary for us to join. Soon after we reefed our topsails, being surrounded on all sides with islands of ice. In the morning of the 29th we let them out again, and set top-gallant sails, still continuing our course to the westward, and meeting with several penguins. At noon we were by observation in the latitude of 59° 12', longitude 19° 1' east, which is 3 degrees more to the west than we were when we first fell in with the field of ice; so that it is pretty clear that it joined to no land, as we conjectured. Having come to a resolution to run as far west as the meridian of Cape Circumcision, provided we met with no impediment, as the distance was not more than 80 leagues, the wind favourable, and the sea seemed to be pretty clear of ice, I sent on board for Captain Furneaux, to make him acquainted therewith; and after dinner he returned to his ship. At 1 o'clock we steered for an island of ice, thinking if there were any loose ice round it, to take some on board, and convert it into fresh water. At 4 we brought to, close under the lee of the island, where we did not find what we wanted, but saw upon it 86 penguins. This piece of ice was about half a mile in circuit, and 100 feet high and upwards, for we lay for some minutes with every sail becalmed under it. The side on which the penguins were rose sloping from the sea, so as to admit them to creep up it. It is a received opinion that penguins never go far from land, and that the sight of them is a sure indication of its vicinity. The opinion may hold good where there are no ice islands, but where such are, these birds, as well as many others which usually keep near the shores, finding a roosting place upon these islands, may be brought by them a great distance from any land. It will, however, be said that they must go on shore to breed, that probably the females were there, and that these were only the males which we saw. Be that as it may, I shall continue to take notice of these birds whenever we see them, and leave every one to judge for himself. We continued our course to the westward, with a gentle gale at east-north-east, the weather being sometimes tolerably clear, and at other times thick and hazy with snow. The thermometer for a few days past was from 31 to 36. At 9 o'clock the next morning, being the 30th, we shot one of the white birds, upon which we lowered a boat into the water to take it up, and by that means killed a penguin, which weighed 11 pounds and a half. The white bird was of the petrel tribe. The bill, which is rather short, is of a colour between black and dark blue, and their legs and feet are blue. I believe them to be the same sort of birds that Bouvet mentions to have seen when he was off Cape Circumcision. We continued our westerly course till 8 o'clock in the evening, when we steered north-west, the point on which I reckon the above-mentioned cape to bear. At midnight we fell in with loose ice, which soon after obliged us to tack, and stretch to the southward. At half an hour past 2 o'clock in the morning of the 31st, we stood for it again, thinking to take some on board, but this was found impracticable; for the wind, which had been at north-east, now veered to south-east, and increasing to a fresh gale, brought with it such a sea as made it very dangerous for the ships to remain among the ice. The danger was yet farther increased by discovering an immense field to the north, extending from north-east by east to south-west by west, farther than the eye could reach. As we were not above 2 or 3 miles from this, and surrounded by loose ice, there was no time to deliberate. We presently wore, got our tacks on board, hauled to the south, and soon got clear, but not before we had received several hard knocks from the loose pieces, which were of the largest sort, and among which we saw a seal. In the afternoon, the wind increased in such a manner as to oblige us to hand the topsails, and strike top-gallant yards. At 8 o'clock we tacked and stood to the east, till midnight, when, being in the latitude of 60° 21' south, longitude 13° 32' east, we stood again to the west. End of Book 1, Chapter 2, Part 1.